When I was 15, my mom decided it was time to settle down again. She met Greg, a man who came with a 19-year-old son, Nathan, from his previous marriage. From the moment they moved in, I knew things wouldn't be easy. Nathan was loud, messy, and had an irritating confidence that made him act like he owned the place. He'd leave dirty plates in the living room, his laundry piled in the hallway, and somehow, I was always the one who got scolded for not keeping things clean. Greg wasn't much better. He had this way of talking to me that felt condescending, like I was some unruly tenant rather than a kid trying to adjust to two strangers taking over her home. Anytime something went wrong, a broken glass, an argument, a misplaced item, it was always somehow my fault. My mom, caught up in the excitement of her new marriage, would brush off my concerns or excuse Greg's behavior with phrases like, "He's just trying to figure out his role as a stepfather," or, "Give Nathan time, he's adjusting too." About a year into this mess, my mom got pregnant. Suddenly, the entire house became a baby prep zone. Walls were repainted, furniture was shifted around, and space became scarce. Guess whose room was chosen to become the nursery? Yep, mine. I was moved into the smallest room in the house, barely more than a storage closet with a twin bed shoved into it. When I brought up how unfair it felt, Greg said something about sacrifices for the family, while Nathan rolled his eyes and muttered something under his breath. My mom just told me to stop being dramatic. By the time my half-brother Adam was born, the family dynamic had shifted completely. Greg became softer, more patient, but only with Adam. Nathan became even more entitled, clearly enjoying his role as the favored older sibling. Meanwhile, I felt like an afterthought. I couldn't even study in peace because Nathan would blast music in his room and Greg would always find some reason to complain about where I set up my books. "You're taking up too much space in the kitchen," he'd say, or, "The dining table isn't your personal desk, Anna." Nathan, who had briefly gone off to college, dropped out after one semester and returned home. He acted like he was some world-weary adult who deserved special treatment. He started throwing parties while Greg and my mom were out, filling the house with loud music and strangers. My things went missing, a favorite sweater, a pair of headphones, and Nathan would just smirk when I confronted him. Greg dismissed it all as sibling rivalry, even though Nathan was almost 21 and I was barely 16. The worst part wasn't even the chaos Nathan brought. It was the way Greg and my mom always excused him. When I tried to set boundaries or defend myself, I was labeled as difficult or overly sensitive. It became exhausting, trying to carve out a space for myself in a house that felt less and less like home every day. School became my escape. I joined every after-school activity I could find: debate club, yearbook committee, tutoring, anything to stay out of the house for as long as possible. I started spending more time at my best friend Emily's place, whose parents were kind and welcoming. Her house felt like the safe haven mine should have been. One night, I stayed late at school working on a group project. When I got home, the house was dark. On the fridge was a note, "Out for dinner, family night." It hit me like a punch to the gut. They didn't even bother inviting me. They'd gone out as a family, and I wasn't part of that equation. I stared at that note for what felt like hours before going to my tiny room and locking the door. Things escalated not long after that. I had been saving money from a part-time job I worked on weekends, hoping to eventually have enough to move out when I turned 18. Greg hated the idea of me working, claiming it was distracting me from my studies, but I knew the real reason. He didn't like me having independence. One Saturday, I came home from work to find my room trashed. Nathan had thrown another party, and for some reason, my room had been the designated hangout spot. Beer stains covered my school notes, a framed photo of me and my dad was smashed on the floor, and some of my clothes were missing. I confronted Nathan in the living room, furious, but he just shrugged and said, "Should have locked your door." Greg, hearing the commotion, stepped in, not to defend me, but to tell me I was overreacting and creating unnecessary drama. That night, I realized I couldn't stay there any longer. I started picking up more shifts at work, quietly stashing away every dollar I could save. I researched affordable apartments near the college I wanted to attend and began mentally preparing myself for the day I could finally leave. When I finally told my mom and Greg that I was moving out, they acted shocked, as if they hadn't spent years making me feel unwelcome. Greg scoffed. You think you're ready for the real world? My mom looked heartbroken but said nothing. I packed my things over the course of a week. My mom helped in silence, offering me a few old dishes and blankets as if those small gestures could make up for everything else. The day I moved into my tiny studio apartment, I felt so many emotions at once: relief, fear, sadness, and excitement. The silence in my new place was deafening at first, but then it started to feel peaceful. I could breathe. I could exist without walking on eggshells. I kept my distance from my mom and Greg after that. I'd visit occasionally, but it was always awkward, always strained. I focused on school, work, and building a life for myself. A life where I didn't have to feel like an outsider in my own home. But, of course, life has a way of circling back around. Moving out felt like escaping a storm I'd been trapped in for years. My tiny studio apartment wasn't much. It had peeling wallpaper, creaky floors, and a heater that only worked when it felt like it, but it was mine. I could close the door and know that no one would barge in. No one would yell at me for existing in their space, and no one would twist every conversation into something I'd done wrong. For the first time in years, I felt some semblance of peace. The initial weeks were tough. I'd underestimated how lonely independence could feel. The silence was heavy, and there were nights I'd lie in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made a mistake. My mom called occasionally, mostly to ask if I was eating properly or if I needed anything, but those calls always felt superficial. Greg never called, and Nathan definitely didn't. It was clear that, to them, I was out of sight, out of mind. I threw myself into work and school, juggling shifts at a local coffee shop with classes and assignments. My days became a routine. Wake up, work, study, sleep, repeat. It wasn't glamorous, but it felt stable. I started saving little by little, building a small safety net for myself. Emily would visit sometimes, bringing takeout and making me laugh until my stomach hurt. Her friendship became my lifeline, a reminder that there were still people in my life who genuinely cared about me. Months passed, and I settled into a rhythm. My relationship with my mom stayed distant but cordial. She'd send the occasional text, "Hope school is going well," but never anything deeper. Greg and Nathan didn't reach out at all. It was fine. I told myself I didn't care. But then, out of nowhere, Greg had a health scare. I heard about it from my mom, who called me one evening sounding uncharacteristically soft. "Greg's in the hospital," she said, her voice wavering slightly. "It's not life-threatening, but it's serious." I didn't know how to respond. Did she expect me to rush to his bedside? To drop everything and play the role of the concerned stepdaughter? I stayed silent, and after a long pause, she added, "We're sorting out some legal things. His will, you know." That caught my attention. Not because I cared about inheriting anything. I didn't. But because it felt like another shoe was about to drop. Sure enough, a week later, my mom called me again. "Greg's decided to include Nathan and Adam in his will," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "But not you. He feels it's only fair since they're his biological children." There it was. The final confirmation of everything I'd felt for years. I wasn't part of their family. Not really. I was just the leftover baggage from my mom's first marriage, someone they had to tolerate until I was old enough to leave. I didn't say much on that call. I didn't cry or yell or demand answers. I just said, "Okay, thanks for letting me know." My mom hesitated, like she wanted to say something more, but in the end, she just sighed and said goodbye. After that, I pulled back even more. I stopped answering my mom's texts as often and stopped visiting altogether. I focused on myself, my classes, my job, my savings. I worked hard, harder than I ever had before, because I knew no one was coming to save me if I failed. Life went on. I graduated from college with decent grades, landed a full-time job in marketing, and moved into a slightly nicer apartment. It still wasn't anything fancy, but it had more space and better lighting, and I could finally afford furniture that wasn't secondhand. Then, out of nowhere, I got a call from a lawyer. At first, I thought it was a scam. I mean, how often do random lawyers just call you? But the voice on the other end was calm, professional, and strangely kind. "I'm calling regarding the estate of your great-aunt Margaret," he said. She passed away recently and named you as the sole beneficiary of her estate. I was stunned. I barely remembered Aunt Margaret. She was my dad's aunt, someone I'd met a handful of times when I was really young. She was quiet, reserved, and always seemed to exist on the fringes of family gatherings. I hadn't seen her in years, and now she'd left me everything? The lawyer explained that Aunt Margaret had been smart with her money. Investments, properties, and savings had all added up over the years, and her estate was worth several $1,000,000. My mind couldn't process it. Millions? Me? The next few weeks were a blur of meetings with the lawyer, signing documents, and trying to wrap my head around what had just happened. I went from carefully budgeting every grocery trip to suddenly having financial freedom I'd never even dreamed of. The first thing I did was buy a modest house. Nothing extravagant, just a small but cozy place in a quiet neighborhood. I set up a savings account, invested a portion of the money, and worked with a financial advisor to make sure I wasn't being reckless. I didn't quit my job. I liked the structure and purpose it gave me, but I cut back on my hours to have a little more time for myself. For a while, I didn't tell anyone about the inheritance. It felt too big, too surreal to share. But secrets like that have a way of leaking out. One day, I got a text from my cousin, someone I hadn't spoken to in years. "Hey, heard about Aunt Margaret. Congrats on the big win." Win. Like it was some kind of lottery prize. Word spread fast. Soon, my mom was calling me more often. Her messages started with casual small talk, but it didn't take long for the hints to start dropping. "Your stepdad's medical bills are really piling up," she'd say. Or, "Adam's school tuition is getting harder to cover." Then came Nathan. He sent me a single text. "Hey, heard you came into some money. Mind helping out your big bro?" Big bro. As if he'd ever acted like one. The requests escalated. My mom asked for just a little help to renovate their kitchen. Greg, who hadn't spoken to me in years, actually called me and launched into a speech about family duty and how it was only right for me to share the wealth. I felt like I was drowning under a pile of guilt-tripping and entitlement. But every time I felt myself starting to waver, I remembered those nights crying in my tiny room, the parties Nathan threw in my space, the cold way Greg dismissed every concern I'd ever had. They didn't see me as family, they saw me as a bank. One evening, after another exhausting call with my mom where she not so subtly hinted that I should give them $1,000,000, I finally said, "No, just that." No explanation, no apology, just no. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening before she finally said, "I can't believe how selfish you've become." But I wasn't selfish. For the first time in my life, I was standing up for myself, and I wasn't going to back down. After I told my mom no, the silence lasted for about 3 days. It was the calm before the storm, and I knew it wouldn't last. Sure enough, the calls started rolling in again. First, it was Greg. He didn't even bother with small talk. "You know, Anna, it's not right. After everything your mother and I did for you, you're just sitting on all that money while we're struggling. You owe us." I felt my stomach twist, but I kept my voice steady. "Greg, you didn't even include me in your will because I wasn't real family. Now you want me to act like family because there's money involved." He stammered something about how I was taking things out of context, but I wasn't interested in hearing his excuses. I hung up before he could finish. Then came Nathan, sliding into my texts with the same casual arrogance he'd always had. "Hey sis, look, I know we've had our differences, but things are rough right now. If you could just loan me like, I don't know, 50K? I'll pay you back. Promise." I didn't bother replying. The final straw, though, was my mom. She showed up unannounced at my house one afternoon. I opened the door to find her standing there with a plastic smile and watery eyes, clutching her purse like it was her lifeline. "Can we talk?" she asked softly. I let her in, mostly because I didn't want my neighbors overhearing whatever was about to go down. We sat at my dining table, her hands trembling slightly as she fiddled with the zipper on her purse. I don't understand why you're being so cold, Anna. We're family. Families help each other. Families also support each other, Mom," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "When did you ever have my back? When did Greg? When did Nathan? You let them treat me like I was an intruder in my own home for years, and now you want to play the family card because there's money involved? She flinched but recovered quickly. It's not about the money, honey. It's about fairness. You know your stepdad's been sick. The bills are piling up, and Adam's school. I cut her off. Stop. Just stop. This isn't about fairness. It's about entitlement. You all treated me like I didn't belong, and now you're acting like I owe you something because Aunt Margaret left me money. You know what's fair? Me finally being able to breathe without worrying about being blamed for everything. She stared at me, her face frozen in an expression that was somewhere between guilt and anger. For a moment, I thought she might apologize. But instead, she said, "You're being incredibly selfish, Anna." I stood up, signaling that the conversation was over. "I think it's time for you to leave." She hesitated, her lips twitching like she wanted to say more, but she grabbed her purse and walked out without another word. I closed the door behind her and stood there for a long time, my head buzzing with anger and sadness. The silence that followed felt heavy, but it was also final. I knew then that whatever fragile connection I still had with my mom and her family had snapped. Over the next few weeks, the phone calls and texts gradually slowed down. It was like they'd finally realized I wasn't going to cave. But instead of peace, I felt this hollow ache in my chest. Despite everything they'd done, everything they'd said, I still wanted them to love me. I still wanted to feel like I belonged somewhere. I started seeing a therapist. At first, I felt ridiculous sitting there, spilling my guts to a stranger, but over time, it helped. I started unpacking years of emotional baggage, years of feeling unwanted and unimportant. I realized how much of my self-worth had been tied to trying to win my family's approval they were never going to give me. Therapy also gave me the tools to set boundaries, real ones. I stopped responding to guilt-tripping texts. I stopped letting their words live rent-free in my head. And slowly, I started to heal. But, of course, peace doesn't last forever. A few months later, I got an official-looking letter in the mail. It was from some lawyer representing my mom. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the first few lines. She was suing me for a portion of the inheritance. I called my own lawyer immediately. He looked over the letter and actually laughed. "This isn't even legally sound," he said, shaking his head. "Your aunt's will was airtight. There's no way she has a case." But that didn't stop the stress from creeping in. My own mother was trying to take me to court over money that was never hers to begin with. It felt surreal, like some twisted soap opera plotline. And then Greg started texting me again. The messages started polite. If you could call passive-aggressive guilt trips polite. But when I ignored him, they turned venomous. "You'll regret this, Anna. Families stick together, and you're acting like a selfish child. We'll take everything from you." The thing is, they couldn't take anything from me. Not legally, not financially, but emotionally. They'd already taken so much. I forwarded everything to my lawyer, who assured me again that there was nothing to worry about. But I still felt like I was walking around with a weight on my chest. Every notification on my phone made my stomach tighten. Every unexpected knock on the door sent my heart racing. I knew I needed a break. I called Emily and a couple of other friends and suggested a road trip. Nothing fancy, just a week away from all of this mess. They agreed immediately. The trip was exactly what I needed. We drove along winding coastal roads, stayed in cheap motels, and laughed until our sides hurt. For the first time in months, I felt free. Not free from Greg or Nathan or my mom, but free from the version of myself that was still trying to earn their love. One night, sitting around a campfire on the beach, Emily turned to me and said, "You know you don't owe them anything, right? Not a single cent. Not an apology. Nothing." And for the first time, I believed her. When I got back home, I felt clearer, stronger. I blocked Greg and Nathan's numbers. I set my mom's contact to silent. I wasn't cutting them out entirely, not yet, but I wasn't going to let them keep pulling me back into their toxic orbit. I threw myself back into work, focused on my goals, and let myself dream about the future, something I'd rarely let myself do before. My inheritance wasn't just money. It was a second chance, a chance to build a life on my terms, without anyone else's expectations weighing me down. But something told me this wasn't over yet. People like Greg and my mom didn't just give up when there was money involved. And I was right. A few weeks after I got back from the road trip, things went quiet again. Too quiet. The texts stopped, the calls dried up, and for a brief moment, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd finally given up. I should have known better. People like Greg and my mom don't just fade into the background when there's money on the table. They retreat, regroup, and come back swinging. The first sign was a Facebook post. My mom isn't exactly tech-savvy, but she knows enough to air her grievances publicly when it suits her. A mutual acquaintance sent me a screenshot. It was a long, rambling post about betrayal and greed. She never mentioned my name directly, but it was obvious who she was talking about. Words like selfish and ungrateful were scattered throughout the paragraph, and the comments section was filled with distant relatives and her friends offering their sympathy. "She's probably just going through something," Emily said when I showed her the screenshot. But I knew better. This wasn't a cry for help. It was a calculated move, a way to turn people against me. Sure enough, the messages started trickling in. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years, distant aunts and uncles I barely remembered, all reaching out to ask how I could do this to my poor mother. The next hit came when I got served. A real lawsuit this time, not the half-baked one from before. My mom was taking me to court, claiming that Aunt Margaret's inheritance rightfully belonged to her because technically it should have gone to her side of the family after my dad passed. I sat in my living room, staring at the papers spread across my coffee table, my hands shaking. It didn't matter that my lawyer had already assured me there was no legal basis for her claim. The idea of going to court against my own mother made me feel sick. When I called my lawyer, he was calm, methodical. "They have no case, Anna. This is just noise. They're hoping you'll panic and settle out of court to make this go away." But settling would mean giving in. It would mean letting them win. And I wasn't going to do that. The next few weeks were a blur of legal meetings, paperwork, and stress headaches. I barely slept. I barely ate. Every time my phone buzzed, my stomach clenched. My mom was still posting on Facebook, still playing the victim, still rallying people to her side. And the worst part? It was working. My cousin Jenny sent me a long message one night, guilt-tripping me about how mom is so stressed she's getting sick over this, and can't you just give her something to make this easier? I didn't reply. One afternoon, my lawyer called me with an update. "They've offered to drop the case if you agree to give them $500,000. I almost laughed. $500,000? Just to make them go away? The audacity was staggering. "No," I said firmly. "We're not giving them anything." He agreed and said he'd handle it. But the stress kept piling up. I started having nightmares about the courtroom, about seeing my mom sitting across from me while lawyers argued over Aunt Margaret's money. One evening, Emily came over with wine and takeout. She plopped onto my couch and said, "You know, you could disappear for a while. Take a break. Just get away from all of this." It wasn't a bad idea. I had the means now. So I booked a cabin in the mountains for a week. No Wi-Fi, no cell service, just silence and pine trees. For the first time in months, I could actually hear myself think. But when I came back, there was another surprise waiting for me. A letter slipped under my door. It wasn't official. It was handwritten. From Adam, my little half-brother. It was messy, written in pencil, and covered in little smudges. "I miss you, Anna. Mom says you're being mean, but I don't think you are. Nathan says you're selfish, but he's mean too. I just wanted to say I miss you." I sat on the floor of my living room and cried harder than I had in years. Adam was just a kid. He didn't ask for any of this. And despite everything, he still reached out to me in the only way he knew how. I wrote him back. A simple letter, just saying that I missed him too and that I hoped he was doing okay. I didn't mention the lawsuit or the money or his parents. Just us. But that little letter stirred something in me. It reminded me why I was fighting so hard to hold my ground. Because if I caved, if I gave them even a fraction of what they were asking for, it wouldn't stop. It would never stop. They'd come back, year after year, clawing for more until there was nothing left. The court date came faster than I expected. My lawyer was confident, but I felt like I was going to throw up the entire morning. Walking into that courtroom and seeing my mom sitting at a table across from me was one of the hardest things I've ever done. She wouldn't look at me. Greg was next to her, arms crossed, a smug expression on his face. The hearing didn't last long. My lawyer laid out the facts. Aunt Margaret's will was crystal clear. The estate was left to me, explicitly and legally. My mom's lawyer, some guy in a cheap suit who looked about 2 steps away from losing his license, fumbled through his arguments. The judge wasn't impressed. The final ruling was exactly what I expected. The lawsuit was dismissed. My mom and Greg had no claim to the money. When we walked out of the courtroom, my mom finally looked at me. Her eyes were glassy, and for a second, I thought she might say something. But she didn't. She turned and walked away, Greg trailing behind her. It should have felt like victory, but it didn't. It felt hollow. In the weeks after the hearing, the silence returned. No more calls, no more texts, no more Facebook posts. It was over, in the messiest and most painful way imaginable. Adam wrote me again. Another little letter, this time saying he was proud of me and that he hoped we could see each other soon. I cried again, but this time, they were tears of relief. I knew things would never go back to how they were. Whatever fragile thread connected me to my mom had been severed completely in that courtroom. But in its place, I had something better, peace. And maybe, just maybe, a chance to build a real relationship with Adam one day. For now, that was enough. After the lawsuit was dismissed, the silence that followed felt eerie. For weeks, I kept waiting for the next shoe to drop. A nasty text, another fake lawyer letter, some dramatic Facebook meltdown. But nothing came. My phone stayed quiet, my mailbox empty, and my mind, well, it wasn't as peaceful as I'd hoped. I'd won, technically, but it didn't feel like winning. I found myself replaying that moment outside the courtroom, the way my mom looked at me, like I was a stranger. There was no anger in her eyes, just emptiness. And Greg, with his usual smug expression, like he still believed he deserved something from me. I kept thinking about Adam, too. His letters were still tucked safely in my nightstand drawer, little reminders that not everything in that house had been bad. I tried to push it all aside and focus on my life. I threw myself back into work, started a couple of new projects, and even forced myself to go out more. Emily made sure of that. She dragged me to brunch or convinced me to join her for an evening hike, and for those few hours, I'd feel normal. But every time I came home, the weight of everything would settle back on my shoulders. One afternoon, a letter showed up in my mailbox. For a second, my stomach flipped, thinking it was another attempt from Greg or my mom. But when I opened it, it was from Adam. Hi Anna, I hope you're okay. Mom and Greg don't talk about you anymore. I asked if I could call you, and they said no, but I wanted to write again. I miss you. I wish you could come visit me at school. I think you'd like it here. Love, Adam. I sat on the floor of my kitchen, holding that letter in my hands, and realized how much I missed him too. He was just a kid, stuck in a house filled with people who used manipulation and guilt like weapons. I wanted to see him, but I knew showing up unannounced would cause more chaos than it was worth. Instead, I wrote him back. I kept it light, told him about my job, about the small garden I'd started on my balcony, and asked about school. I didn't mention Greg or my mom. I didn't want him to feel like he had to choose sides. The letters became a regular thing. Every few weeks, I'd get another envelope in the mail with Adam's messy handwriting on the front. He'd tell me about his science projects, about a friend he'd made at school, or about the family dog who apparently still slept outside my old bedroom door. It felt good to have that connection, even if it was limited to paper and ink. But things weren't entirely over. About a month after the lawsuit was dismissed, I got another call from my lawyer. He'd been contacted by someone claiming to represent Greg again. But this time, it wasn't about money. It was about Adam. Greg had apparently caught wind that Adam and I were exchanging letters. I don't know how, maybe Adam had mentioned it. Maybe Greg was snooping through his things. Either way, he wasn't happy. He was threatening to cut off Adam's access to me entirely, claiming that I was a bad influence. My lawyer advised me to stay calm, not to respond directly to Greg, and to let him handle it. But I couldn't stay calm. The idea of Greg using Adam as another pawn in his game made me sick. I wanted to call my mom, to scream at her, to ask her how she could let this happen. But I knew it wouldn't change anything. Instead, I wrote one final letter to Adam. I told him that if he ever needed me, really needed me, He could always reach out. I gave him my email, my phone number, and told him to keep them somewhere safe. I promised him that I'd always be here for him, no matter what. And then, I stopped sending letters. It broke me, knowing that Greg had effectively cut off one of the few genuine connections I still had to that family. But I couldn't risk making things worse for Adam. He was just a kid, and he didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of this mess. The months that followed were quiet, painfully so. I went back to therapy, trying to process not just the lawsuit, but the loss of my connection with Adam. My therapist said something during one of our sessions that stuck with me. Sometimes, walking away is the most loving thing you can do for someone. I hated that it was true. In the meantime, I kept building my life. I traveled a little, nothing extravagant, just short weekend trips to nearby cities. I picked up new hobbies, started painting badly, and even adopted a cat from a local shelter. Her name's Olive, and she follows me around the apartment like a shadow. One day, out of nowhere, I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. The subject line just said, "Hi, Anna." It was from Adam. He said he'd used a friend's tablet at school to email me. He told me that things at home weren't great. Greg was stricter than ever, and my mom spent most of her time pretending everything was fine. He said he missed me, that he'd hidden the letter I sent with my email and phone number so no one would find it. And then he asked if he could see me. My heart was in my throat as I read those words. I didn't want to make things worse for him, but I also couldn't ignore him. I wrote back, asking if he could meet me somewhere neutral, a park, maybe, or a library. Somewhere public, somewhere safe. We planned it carefully. Adam had a school event one Saturday morning, and he said he could slip away afterward without Greg noticing. I showed up early to the park we'd agreed on, pacing nervously near a bench. And then, I saw him. He looked taller, older, but he was still just a kid. When he spotted me, he broke into a grin and ran toward me, throwing his arms around me in a hug. I had to swallow back tears as I hugged him tightly, my little brother who'd been caught in the crossfire of all this mess. We sat on the bench for an hour, just talking. He told me about school, about his favorite video games, about how he'd started learning guitar. I asked if he was okay, if he felt safe, if he needed anything. He hesitated but said, "I'm okay for now." When it was time for him to go, I gave him another piece of paper with my information on it, told him to keep it hidden, and hugged him one last time. After he left, I sat on that bench for a long time, watching people walk by and trying to process everything. I couldn't save Adam from that house, not yet, anyway, but at least he knew I was here. At least he knew he wasn't alone. For now, that had to be enough. The weeks after seeing Adam felt heavy and fragile at the same time, like I was holding onto something precious but knew it could shatter at any moment. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification, I half expected it to be him, or worse, Greg or my mom finding out about our meeting. But nothing happened. Silence stretched on, and I clung to the hope that Adam was safe, that he was managing in that house. Life went back to its usual rhythm: work, therapy, quiet evenings with Olive curled up next to me. I started focusing on myself again, planning for the future in a way I'd never felt secure enough to do before. I was building something real for myself, a life free from guilt, manipulation, and endless compromises. But one Friday night, as I was unwinding after a long week, my phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. "Anna?" It was Adam. His voice was small, shaky. "Adam? What's wrong?" I asked, my stomach twisting into knots. I had to leave. I can't stay there anymore. Greg. He got really mad, and Mom didn't stop him. I had to go. My heart dropped. "Where are you?" He gave me the name of a gas station a few miles away from my old neighborhood. I grabbed my keys and was out the door in under a minute. When I pulled into the dimly lit parking lot, I spotted him sitting on the curb, clutching a backpack to his chest. His face was streaked with tears, and his shoulders were trembling. I parked and ran over to him, kneeling down in front of him. Hey, you're okay now. I've got you," I said softly. He didn't say anything, just threw his arms around my neck and sobbed into my shoulder. We stayed like that for a while, until his breathing slowed and he stopped shaking. I helped him into the passenger seat of my car, handed him a bottle of water, and asked if he was hurt. He shook his head. As I drove us back to my apartment, he started talking, hesitantly at first, but then it all spilled out. Greg had been in one of his moods, angry over something trivial, and Adam had gotten the brunt of it. My mom, as usual, had done nothing to intervene. Adam had packed a bag and slipped out when Greg went to bed, walking miles to the gas station to call me. When we got to my apartment, I made him some tea and set him up on the couch with Olive curled in his lap. He looked so small sitting there, clutching the mug with both hands. "You don't have to go back there," I said finally. He nodded, his eyes wide and serious. "I know. I don't want to." The reality of the situation started sinking in. He couldn't go back. But I also knew Greg and my mom wouldn't just let him disappear without a fight. The next morning, I called my lawyer. I explained everything, what Adam had told me, how he'd shown up, and how I couldn't, in good conscience, send him back. My lawyer was blunt but kind. "You need to report this to Child Services, Anna. If you want to keep him safe, we have to go through the proper channels." So, that's what I did. I made the call, my voice shaking as I explained the situation to a social worker. Adam sat beside me, clutching Olive in his lap, listening quietly. The process was long and exhausting. Interviews, paperwork, home visits. Every day felt like a new mountain to climb. Meanwhile, my mom and Greg realized Adam was gone. The texts started coming in almost immediately. First from my mom, pleading, guilt-tripping, begging me to bring Adam back. Then from Greg, angry, threatening messages about how I was ruining their family. I saved every single one and forwarded them to my lawyer. Adam stayed with me through it all. I enrolled him in a local school, made sure he had everything he needed, and slowly, I watched him start to relax. The dark circles under his eyes began to fade, and he started smiling more. He and Olive became inseparable. Wherever he went, she followed. One evening, as we were eating dinner, Adam looked up from his plate and said quietly, "I don't think Mom's going to come for me." I put my fork down, my chest tightening. "Why do you say that?" He shrugged, picking at his food. "She never really fought for me before. Why would she start now?" I didn't know how to respond to that. He was right, and it broke my heart. Eventually, the case went to court. I sat beside Adam as my lawyer presented everything, the evidence of neglect, the threats from Greg, the fact that Adam had run away because he didn't feel safe. My mom and Greg sat across from us, their faces tight and cold. My mom wouldn't even look at Adam. The judge ruled in our favor. Custody of Adam was officially transferred to me. When the gavel came down, Adam let out a breath I didn't realize he'd been holding, and I pulled him into a hug. Greg stormed out of the courtroom without a word. My mom lingered for a moment, staring at us with a mix of sadness and resentment, but she turned and walked away. Adam came home with me that day, not as a visitor, not as a runaway, but as family. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest and hardest of my life. Adam was safe, yes, but there were still wounds that needed time to heal. Some nights, he'd wake up crying from nightmares. Other times, he'd get quiet and withdrawn, and it would take gentle coaxing to get him to talk about what was on his mind. But there were good moments too. Movie nights with popcorn and blankets. Watching him light up when he brought home a good grade. Laughing at Olive's ridiculous antics together. For the first time in years, my apartment felt warm and alive. One afternoon, as we were walking back from the grocery store, Adam slipped his hand into mine and said, "Thanks for coming to get me." I squeezed his hand gently. "Always, Adam. Always." We kept moving forward. Slowly, steadily, we built something real together. A home, a family, a place where both of us could finally breathe. Looking back now, I realized that the inheritance, the money, the lawsuit, it was never really about those things. It was about freedom. Freedom from people who saw me as a resource instead of a person. Freedom to build a life that felt safe, secure, and mine. And in the end, that freedom didn't just save me. It saved Adam too.